John 19 verse 30 says, Jesus said, "It is finished," and bowed his head and gave up the ghost. Now, many people read this verse and they think it as, they understand it to be saying that when Jesus died on the cross, the work or the plan of salvation was fully completed. And to a point, I am going to agree with them on this, with this view. But the full plan of salvation or redemption was not completed at the cross. If this plan of redemption was completed fully at the cross, then we should not be on this earth anymore. Because the only reason why we're here is because the plan of redemption hasn't been completed. I want us to look at a couple of texts that's going to show us the work of Christ and what was to be completed after his work for us, dying for us on the cross. Come with me to 1 Peter and look at verse 18. 1 Peter verse 18, and we're going to look at verse 19 as well. For as much as ye know that ye were not redeemed with corruptible things, as silver and gold. So we were not redeemed with corruptible things. Now, in the Bible, silver and gold was their currency. It wasn't dollars or rands as we have today, but they used silver and gold. Listen, with what we were redeemed, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. So here we see the first phase of Christ's work when he came to the earth. He was to be a lamb without blemish and without spot. And that is the reason why Christ was born into this world, so that he could grow up from a child to manhood, a perfect and spotless life, to be a sacrifice for our sins. So we were not bought with corruptible things as silver and of gold, but with the precious blood of Christ. So the first phase of Christ's ministry was to buy us, or to redeem us with his blood. Because we know that according to Romans 6, I believe it's verse 23, that the wages of sin is death. So Christ had to die for us, thus paying the price that we had to pay for sins. Now I want us to see what was the second work that Christ was supposed to accomplish after he died as a lamb for us. What is the reason that we are not yet in heaven today? What was the second work that Christ was supposed to do, and the third work that still needs to be done? 1 Peter 3 verse 18 says, For Christ also has once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust. So we just read that in the previous verse. That he might bring us to God. So after Christ, we saw in chapter 1, after Christ bought us with his blood, we see in chapter 3 that the second work was to bring us to God. Now, we also see this in the Old Testament, so it's not just something that Peter is bringing up here in the New Testament. If you look at Leviticus 25, I believe, verse 51 and 55, we see that in the plan of redemption, the sinner was bought with a price, that price being the lamb that was supposed to pay for his sins, and the lamb would actually buy the sinner back. And then we see that the second work in verse 55 of Leviticus 25 was to bring the sinner back to God. So we see that Christ's second work, not anymore as a lamb, because when he came to the earth, he died as a lamb for our sins, buying our redemption, paying for our redemption. His second work is to bring us to God. And we see that this bringing is represented by Christ's mediation, or the work of mediation that he does in the heavenly sanctuary. Now we know that according to Hebrews 12 verse 24, that Jesus is the mediator, and the work of mediation was to be done in the holy place. We see that in the holy place, the priest would take the blood of the lamb and sprinkle it on the horns of the altar. And Hebrews 12 verse 24 says, And to Jesus the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaketh better things than that of Abel. So Jesus' second work after he died for us as a lamb was to enter the holy place with his own blood. We see that in Hebrews 9 verse 12, neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood he entered once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption. Now redemption was the price that he paid for our sins by dying on the cross. He had already obtained the eternal redemption, but in the plan of salvation there were three phases, and one of those phases was Christ's mediation for us in the holy place with the sprinkling of blood. I want us to look at the third phase of Christ's work for us. And this is the place where many people disagree. But I want to prove to us that this is totally biblical, and all the apostles actually understood that there were three phases to the work. We have already seen the two phases represented in the Bible. The work of Christ dying for us as a lamb. Nobody will have a problem with us saying that Christ was the lamb and died for our sins. But people have a problem when we say that Christ is now in heaven doing a work of mediation and a work of putting away of sins. Many people don't have a problem when we say that Christ died for us on the cross as a lamb to pay for our redemption. But the other two phases many people have a problem with. I want us to look at 1 Peter chapter 4 verse 1. So we already read in 1 Peter chapter 1 how that Jesus bought us with his blood. We saw in chapter 3 that he had once suffered, and after he suffered he was to bring us to God, and that is represented by his work of mediation in the holy place of the sanctuary. He entered in with his own blood, and there is a mediator by the sprinkling of blood. We can see this in the Old Testament throughout the sanctuary. When the lamb was killed, the blood was to be taken into the holy place and sprinkled onto the horns of the altar. Now I want us to see what is Christ's final work for us. 1 Peter chapter 4 verse 1, it says, "For as much then as Christ has suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same." So here we see that Christ had suffered once for us in the flesh. And now what was supposed to happen after Christ suffered? Arm yourselves likewise with the same mind. For he that has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. So we see that the final work is that after Christ already forgave us for our sins, paid the price for our sins, after Christ's mediation for us, bringing us to God, the final work of Christ in which we have to cooperate is in ceasing or to completely stop sin in our lives. Now I just want us to see this. Come with me to Hebrews verse 27. It says, "And as it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this the judgment." Let us read verse 28. "So Christ was once offered to bear the sins of many, and unto them that look for him shall he appear the second time without sin unto salvation." So here we see the plan that after Christ died, there was to be a work of judgment, and then he is to appear, and there is to be no more sin. We see in Leviticus 16 that the last phase of the earthly sanctuary, or the last work that was to be done, was that sin was to be put out of the lives of all the congregation of Israel. And that day was actually called the Day of Atonement, which is in the Hebrew called Yom Kippur, and that word also means a day of judgment. So the last phase of Christ's work was to do a work of judgment in the most holy place of the sanctuary. We see that on the Day of Atonement, when sins were separated, or the Day of Judgment, that work was done in the most holy place of the sanctuary. And likewise, Christ in the heavenly sanctuary as a priest has to complete his work by doing a work of judgment. We see that in Hebrews 9, verse 27 and verse 28, that he has to do a work of judgment, and after that he is to return unto salvation with no sins. So I hope that this helped us to understand a bit more of Christ's work, and to understand what does it mean when Christ cried out on the cross that it is finished. It wasn't finished as in the whole plan of redemption was finished, but his work as a lamb, the suffering of Christ as a lamb, was finished at the cross. The price that he had to pay to redeem us from sin was finished at the cross. But then Christ ascended into the heavenly sanctuary as a high priest. There he sat down on the right hand of Christ, of God, and did a work of mediation with the sprinkling of blood, not the sprinkling of blood of goats and lambs, but of his own blood. And then he was to enter the most holy place to do a work of removing sin from our lives. Removing sin so that when he returns, he would return unto the completion of salvation and the complete removal of sin from the world. Guys, again for watching. If you made it this far, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe. Until then, next time.